Innovation and creativity are central to entrepreneurship. But what happens when you go beyond the edge? The Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast brings you the world's first, the disruptive, the avant-garde. We take you to the frontier in conversation with the entrepreneurs who are the forerunners of the industries of the future. Get to know their world with co-hosts Braden Kemp and Tracy Morningstar. Giant kelp forests, mangrove thickets, expanses of seagrasses. These gentle ecological reserves are also effective carbon sinks. These are highly efficient natural engines of CO2 removal. And then there are commercial seaweed farms, being recognized as important players in ocean climate action. A Canadian artificial intelligence startup is now using satellite imagery to measure underwater biomass. Today, we dive into the oceans and take you to the frontier of the blue carbon economy with Thomas Storwick, co-founder of Coastal Carbon.
We're taking you to the frontier with Thomas Storwick from Coastal Carbon. We'll be taking a journey with Thomas into the deep waters of the ocean and how AI is being used for seaweed, aquaculture, and ocean reforestation. I want to thank you, Thomas, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the term reforestation. How does that work in the ocean when we're talking about seaweed?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think as humans, we like to gravitate towards trees, and tree-based analogies get worked a lot here. And so there are ecosystems that are formed of large or small seaweeds that form the base plant of that ecosystem, much like a tree or a grassland would have sort of like its base plant. I'm not doing a great job of explaining this, but I think it's getting across. And so when we talk about restoring those ecosystems, oftentimes you start sort of from the very bottom, the primary producer in that ecosystem. And in this case, that's seaweed. And so because these, and specifically if we're talking about sort of giant kelp on the West Coast, of course, these huge tall structures and the sunlight filters through them, and they kind of look like trees, and so we call it reforestation. And then there's similar metrics associated to it. So, area covered, the health of each individual plant, etc.
Thomas, continuing that metaphor, we talk about reforestation on land. Typically, we're referring to a forest that's been, for whatever reason, logged, or maybe it was burned, or it once was and now it is not. Is that similar in the case of seaweed, or is there large areas of ocean that at some point hosted that environment and no longer are?
Yeah, that's a great question, Braden. Unfortunately, we've lost the majority of our seaweed ecosystems, or at least really strong ones in North America. And that's mostly due to ocean warming and human activity. I know, like in California, one thing that gets talked about a lot is the urchin barrens, where you get large populations of sea urchins and they completely will deforest and strip an area clean of seaweed. And again, then the whole ecosystem dies off because of that. Yeah. And so talking about reforestation, I would say the problem is analogously much worse than typically on land. We talk about forests that have burned down with forest fires that have been logged, but they're just usually a surrounding forest. The ocean is truly in dire straits when it comes to, the level of seaweed and seaweed forests available.
And in human fashion, are we sort of ignoring that because it's not something that we see in our day-to-day life?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from those of us who come from sort of the central and drier parts of the country, I think we ignore it a lot more. It's very top of mind for most coastal communities, especially those that are more remote or Indigenous and they live and work in the waters and the land. And it's important to them for food and economic reasons and cultural reasons. And so it gets ignored a lot by, I think, the larger set of the population. But for those who work with it every day, it's top of mind.
With AI technology, how has it affected our ability to not really interfere with the growth of seaweed?
Yeah. There's a good quote by a person that I can't remember, which is, you can't manage what you can't measure. right? And so if we're talking about making best use of restoration dollars or action dollars in any way, you have to know where to put them and what they're doing. And measuring things in the ocean is very, very difficult. I mean, and it's kind of funny to say, but mostly because the ocean is water. And so where, you might do a survey around a forest by just walking that forest or recording something along a transect, which is a line where you mark down all the species you see, or talking to people that live and work in that forest and have a better sense of it, or, drone survey or an airline survey. In the ocean, you're talking about divers, and divers are really expensive. The places where we have some of the best seaweed forests tend to be pretty strong currents, pretty bad winds, and it's very, very expensive and pretty hazardous to do a large-scale ecosystem survey. And so without having those measurements, you can't do a good job of managing that ecosystem. Managing it's very expensive. And so we're kind of flying blind when we're in the ocean right now. And so what we do is use AI to enable remote sensing and satellite imaging of all these ecosystems. And our big sort of ethos is that we can give you all the data you need without ever going there. And we stay out of that ecosystem, out of their hair, and give people the information they need to do a better job restoring it, understanding it, or advocating for that ecosystem. To say, hey, this is under threat. Hey, we're doing a good job restoring it, and really be able to speak on behalf of it.
How has that positive impact contributed to restoring the natural stock of the seaweed?
We're at very early stage when it comes to large-scale ocean restoration. And so there are a couple big wins we can point to. In terms of sea forestation, OceanWise has done some great work on the BC coast, showing real reforestation. Lower down in California, a little less Canadian-centric, but Ocean Rainforest, UC Berkeley have done some really great jobs in doing targeted projects where they've gone in, they've outplanted new seaweed. So they've basically done the equivalent of planting trees. They've watched it grow up, and as it grows, they can see, herring stocks come back, salmon stocks come back. More in BC, we're talking about salmon, and really the whole ecosystem grow up around it. That's been possible because they've had the funding to do active management and active data collection. And a lot of this work is funded by NOAA and the government in a way that they can really get it off the ground. And it's really great work. But if we're going to scale that and restore, our entire coastline, Canada's got somewhere 3.5 or 350,000 kilometers of coastline, if I remember correctly, we can't dive that. And so we're going to need better management practices if we're going to, put the earth back how we found it.
Is this where carbon credits come into play, where you're able to generate dollars in order to support those initiatives?
Exactly. So we recognize now that the value that these ecosystems have, both from an intrinsic value, but also a carbon value. And so using carbon credits as a financing strategy makes it possible for not just the large-scale organizations, but also the smaller-scale ones to fund restoring their local sea ecosystems. And so one of the most exciting types of customers for us, and one of the ones we're working partner with right now, is Indigenous groups along the BC coast who have seen the damage to their local ecosystems. They haven't had the typical economic development opportunities that have been afforded large-scale cities purely due to logistics. And carbon credits forms a really interesting opportunity for them to both restore their ecosystem and get a strong economy or an extra economy into that community in a way that you don't have to fundamentally change the landscape of that community. And I mean that physically. So you don't have to put in new roads and factories and build out an industry like logging or forestry in that community. You get to use carbon financing to do that.
Would those coastal Indigenous communities have been engaged in harvesting seaweed either from an aquaculture stance or just harvesting wild seaweed traditionally, or is this a new opportunity?
The communities that have lived and worked on these communities since time immemorial, if they're Indigenous, or rather more recently if they're not, they tend to have a really good relationship with their local coastline. And so many of them have already done seaweed aquaculture in the past or other types of aquaculture. A lot of times there are wild harvest, but that's usually at a much smaller scale. And you can use carbon financing and biodiversity financing both in the pure restoration side and on the aquaculture side, as long as the aquaculture is done correctly and done in a regenerative way.
I want to go sort of back to the concept of carbon credits, because I think it's something that we all hear about, and I'll bet that most people are like me and maybe don't understand it all that well. Can you give us a bit of a backgrounder on carbon credits, and specifically, I think you would refer to blue carbon credits in your instance?
Yeah, for sure. I would say the easiest way to explain carbon credits is that everyone, I think now, or most people recognize that there is a real climate crisis and that we have to do something about our levels of carbon output. There's a ton of interesting work happening in decarbonization, but not all of that can happen for every industry right away. The example that I think is best used here is something like airlines, where, electric planes are interesting, but they're a long way off. And so the airline industry right now really wants to decarbonize. I think Delta Airlines is putting $200 million to carbon crediting already, and I think is making a commitment to put a fair bit more. And because they want to be net zero, they want to offset and to remove the effect they're having on the planet, but they can't do so without offsetting that. Specifically, how this works is they basically pay someone else to take out the carbon that they're adding to the atmosphere, or their emissions they're adding to the atmosphere. We've seen a lot of pushback to that idea, mostly because the accounting of that carbon has sometimes been suspect. And so I think everyone will point to an article by The Guardian that said that many of the credits that specifically Delta Airlines had purchased weren't worth anything. And that's one of the reasons we started this company, is we have a chance in the blue carbon space as it takes off to do it right the first time. And if we have really good measurements and really good, generally we call it MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, and sometimes some other letters are added to that depending on measurement, monitoring, reporting, verification. We have a chance to do it right the first time and make sure that everyone believes in the quality and the permanence of a blue carbon credit.
I'll follow that one up again. So from what I understand about seaweed, which I'll admit is limited, it has a really substantial ability to sequester carbon, but it seems like there's been limited success in connecting that sequestered carbon into the carbon credit system. And is that MRV that you're referring to? Is that the roadblock there? Is just being able to verify and quantify the carbon sequestration through these aquaculture projects?
Exactly. It's making sure that every aquaculture project is sequestering exactly what they say, and we have a really solid understanding of how much seaweed grown in a certain area of a certain type is turning into, which type of not only carbon sequestered, but sequestered for how long, what percent is sequestered for 100 years, what's sequestered for 1,000, what is the different relative price of, 100-year carbon versus 1,000-year carbon, and what are the co-benefits associated with that? What is the benefit to the local fishery? What is the benefit to the local community? And how are those priced in?
Is it the AI technology that's measuring the health of the seaweed?
Exactly. And so none of this remote monitoring would be possible without AI. And so we're using AI to do measurements that weren't possible before at a scale that wasn't feasible.
Can you talk a little more about the AI technology?
Yeah. Understandably, as an early stage startup, we're keeping a little under wraps.
Yes.
But generally, we use AI models to do quantification of a number of ecosystem parameters. So we've trained AI models that can look at an ecosystem based on a number of data streams and determine things like the biomass, the biodiversity, the level of what we call biofouling on the seaweed, which can sometimes be good or bad, depending on what you're looking for, and stuff like that.
Talking about sensors in water, or is there a satellite aspect to this as well? Is that even something you can measure from satellite?
Yeah. So actually, it's mostly remote based, largely using satellites. And the idea behind that is, if we're working in communities where it's very hard to get to, we want to be able to serve them in a way that scales. And so if we have to visit every site, that's not a feasible option going into the future. And so we very carefully designed a product that lets us measure and manage a site without ever going there. And so we can leave the on-the-ground work to the people that actually know that ground.
Yeah, very good.
So it's like forestation in, the forest itself, because it's who manages the forest and controls the growth of the forest. So this is why associating yourself with the Indigenous groups is also important, because they have access to the area.
Right. And they're often the best stewards. We've seen mostly Indigenous groups leading the way in these types of initiatives. They're often really good stewards of the land. They're highly interested in restoration and carbon financing and climate action in general. And so I think this is a real place where we can all learn from the actions of our Indigenous partners and how much time and energy and capital they put up front to solving this problem. And they're really, I would say, at the forefront of ocean restoration and carbon action.
Are you focused, Thomas, mostly on Canada at the moment? I mean, seaweed's something that grows around the globe. Is Canada the launch point and you go from there?
Yeah, great question. We're focused mostly on North America. We have a couple of European projects. Currently, we're focused on larger cold water seaweeds that are mostly kelp-based. They're much larger. And that's just because it was what we chose as our first point of entry. And so we are focused on where that grows, as I guess the best way to put it. And that is Middle and North America, some in South America, and the northern half of Europe.
Give me a sense of the scope or the size, I guess, of these aquaculture projects. Like, are we talking about a football field worth of kelp and seaweed? Are we talking, like, what is the...
Oh, we're talking about tons.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a typical project we're working with is usually around 10 hectares. A hectare is around 3 city blocks. And so they're quite large areas, growing quite a bit of kelp. A moderate-sized farmer with us will harvest 1.8 million pounds of seaweed during their operation. And so there's a huge volume here that's happening.
Where's that seaweed going? What's the end market for it?
A couple in markets.
Well, that's not your business, but I'm asking anyway.
Yeah. It's not necessarily the part we deal with directly. Most of it goes for food right now, seaweed-based products, and a number of food additives are seaweed-based as well. Aside from that, there is a fairly big cosmetic market, a moderate-sized chemical market, and then small scale right now, but growing in size, is what they call biostimulants, which is a seaweed-based regenerative fertilizer. So it's a replacement for fertilizer that does the same job, but it's entirely bio-based, and it's much better for the environment, has much less nitrogen runoff, etc.
Funny how these worlds collide. Sometimes I'm involved in a national pitch competition in innovation in agriculture that actually just recently closed, and there was a company that was a part of that program that was doing exactly that with seaweed product and biostimulants. So it's cool to see that come full circle.
We're really excited about the outlook of seaweed as a product. As we sort of, as a society, get better at sort of growing things and understand where we can grow regenerative products to have the least impact on the planet. Seaweed requires, no land, no fresh water. It often soaks up the excess nutrients in the ocean rather than we having to fertilize them and add them again. And so the places where we need just sort of like biomass and plant matter, something like regenerative fertilizers and foodstuffs, where generally calories are calories if we're consuming them the right way and they taste good. And if we're trying to feed the planet, looking at seaweed that is so beneficial to grow as well as use is a great option.
We know that we're providing a mechanism for polluters to offset in industries that are harder to decarbonize or will take longer to decarbonize. How does the business model for coastal carbon work, and what's the financial play there?
Yeah. And I would just start off that carbon financing is not the only method of helping out these projects. And so there's interest right now in biodiversity financing, which is sort of a biodiversity credit analogous to a carbon credit that some organization that has had a harm on biodiversity or wants to improve biodiversity can pay for that to be done through seaweed. Similarly, there's nitrogen crediting schemes for fertilizer runoff that ends up in the ocean, causes algae blooms, and you can combat that with seaweeds in that area. So there are a number of options that we help support. Carbon is the one that gets talked about the most, but I think there are really other interesting options. In terms of our business model, it sort of depends on how we're supporting. We offer a number of services just directly to seaweed farmers to give them more information and access about their farm, helping them plan their harvest better, helping them understand their farm, helping them get good peace of mind that their farm is still around if they decide to take a week and not visit it, because sometimes they float away in the currents, sometimes they get hit by boats. Make sure there's no whale entrapment that we see remotely, because that's a large problem. And something that we always want to be mindful of is making sure that we're not damaging the ecosystem. So yeah, we offer direct services there. And then if we're helping someone out with carbon financing, with possibly biodiversity or nitrogen financing, we take sort of a different pricing and business model approach to that.
What is the importance of seaweed to our future?
Yeah, it's a great question. Do you mind if I double down on that and ask, are you talking economically, culturally?
Obviously, we know with our forests that they're also depleted and we don't have very much old growth forests, but we do know that our forests still will have a continued impact in the future. It's how we manage it. So I'm just thinking in terms of seaweed, is it very similar where we have to really take a strong look at it for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. In a couple ways. So, number one, just sort of from the top, is we talk about the Amazon being the lungs of the planet, but the ocean is the actual lungs of the planet. Well, 2 out of 3 every breaths you take were made in the ocean. And so there's a large oxygen benefit from seaweed, just straight off the top. But perhaps more quantifiable and stuff that gets talked out about every day is there's a huge economic benefit, especially with the large coastline that Canada has, to grow seaweed in a way that is helpful for biofuels, for biostimulants, for food-based aquaculture products, and to mop up some of the damage that we've done to the environment, be it nitrogen, carbon, or biodiversity. Beyond that, there are real benefits that seaweed restoration has to fisheries. And Canada has a very large fisheries industry that has seen real declines in sort of the last 10, 15 years. And some of that is overfishing, but there's a decent amount of that is due to habitat damage. And all these systems are linked, and we've seen real benefits actually when we've done seaweed restoration in certain areas where, we've done a seaweed outplanting, we've left it in, we've seen the herring come back to ecosystems in places they haven't been in 15, 20 years. And then as the herring come back, the salmon have something to eat. And now your salmon population is increasing. And that, number one, feeds your community, and then the fishermen harvest more. And so they get, a better economic return. But it also then the salmon, when they do that runoff, feed the bears, and that it all cascades into each other. And so much like a forest, managing sort of the primary producer of that ecosystem well and restoring it can have, many, many economic benefits down the line.
Thank you for explaining that. I like that, our ecosystem, and when we're talking about the forestry and we're talking about the environment of the seaweed, is that it protects sea life also.
Yeah, exactly.
Things we don't think of. Planet.
Can't see it often. It's just under the water.
Yes.
That concept of seaweed as kind of like a core driver of biodiversity and habitat in the ocean. Is that concept something that's really obvious and well known to people who have exposure to the coast in general? And I ask because I come from South Central Ontario. I'm a long way from an ocean, probably about as far as you could get from an ocean, actually. And when you think of the concept of clear cutting, it's very apparent to me that if you come in and log an area, especially clear cut it, for the most part, at least the large mammals that live there, they aren't going to live there anymore until that forest regrows. The small ones will stick around. Sometimes you'll make better habitat for small birds and turkeys and what have you. But generally, your deer and your bears and those sort of creatures are going to vacate the area for a while. But it never occurred to me, because I'm so far from the ocean, that seaweed would have such a profound effect on the biodiversity. Is that just because I'm from the middle of a giant landmass and I don't have a connection to the ocean, or are people who even do have that exposure, is that concept of the seaweed as the forest of the ocean something that just is very well known, or are we just learning about that now?
Yeah, it's a great question.
It's a long question. I apologize for that.
Yeah, I'll answer in multiple parts. And a caveat beforehand, too, is we've talked about biodiversity here as being sort of one of the major things. But it's not only the number of species, but it's the amount of that. So it's not only like the seaweed biomass, but it's the whole ecosystem biomass and the diversity of it. So it's not just having 100 species, it's having 4 times the amount of each of those 100 individual species. And that's a more robust ecosystem, and an ecosystem that can be more resilient to change. In terms of understanding that as a local community, I would say that the people that lived in and sort of worked in these ecosystems, largely Indigenous, but also sometimes not, had a good understanding. If you worked in and around seaweed, if you're a shrimp fisherman or a crab fisherman or a finfish fisherman, I think you had a decent understanding. Scientifically, this understanding has been well understood for going back a number of decades. The interesting thing about the ocean is that we don't live underwater. And so a lot of times these types of ecosystem benefits go completely unnoticed. And it can be hard to tell, especially on the BC coast, where you have sometimes not very clear waters, they're not very turbid, and they're very cold. Means that you don't see when a seaweed forest is gone. You don't tend to notice. You just notice it not washing up on the beach, and that's kind of a nicer beach sometimes. And so you're not noticing, the 100 tons of salmon that no longer exist in that area because they're all deep underwater and you don't really see them.
Or is this reforestation? I don't know if I'm necessarily using that term correctly, but is this something that salmon, for Canadian salmon fishermen in general, are calling for it?
Yeah, there is definitely some action in that area. It can be hard as an individual fisherman to think sort of long term, especially if you're really struggling to make a livelihood. And some really are right now because of the fish stocks, and sometimes the quotas that are put on those to protect those fish stocks. But there is real call to bring back these ecosystems to boost those stocks, for sure.
It's a question that's not necessarily about your company, but do you think as humans, coastal humans, can we affect a large enough change in something like kelp forests and seaweed to really make an impact in bringing back that biomass that you speak of?
Yes. And where I'm coming from is these are massive challenges for sure. And sometimes I know, especially looking at the state of both where we are in climate and ecosystem action where we'd like to be and the huge difference between that, it can be demoralizing, and there can be sort of a lack of optimism. Where I always like to come back with that is sort of two examples. Number one, it is amazing as humans that we've been able to cause climate change at all. We are a species of, I think, 11 billion people now that has managed to double, I think, almost the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that is insane. And so I know that's a terrible thing, but it is also a testament to we can make change when our incentives are aligned too. And we are more technologically advanced than ever. We're better at manipulating our industries than ever. And I think we can make real change. And the second example within that, and it's much smaller, is everyone mocks plastic straws and, how that didn't really make a large market change in, the ecosystem. But on the flip side, we have replaced an entire worldwide supply chain in like 8 months because of recognizing the harm of plastic straws. And that's real change. We've almost fully have phased out plastic straws, I think, in most of Canada and a large amount of the US and a fair amount of the world. And so we just need to start picking up problems like that. You mentioned, that only makes a change on a small stream in one place in Ontario, but there are only so many streams in Ontario, and you only need 50 trees each. And that is a very solvable problem for, a society as advanced and as capable as we are. And so then closing that loop, absolutely, we can make change in the ocean. We have the technology, we have what's available, we can develop what we don't have. And if we can accidentally cause damage to it, we can, with purpose, absolutely rebuild it.
To me, it's about education. It's about educating people about carbon credits that will essentially contribute back to the projects that you continue to work on and the AI technology that you use to provide information to the people, to the farmers, etc.
Yeah, it's absolutely about that. And recognizing that there will be some bumps on the road. Mm-hmm. We won't get these markets right the first time. There will be some bad carbon credits issued. And as long as we learned from every mistake, we tighten our belts and we start to tighten down and clamp down on what is and is not really helping the environment and getting a good understanding of that, there is real potential for initiating change here.
I think that's a good way to end our conversation with optimism. And I just want to thank you, Thomas, for joining us once again. I'd also like to thank my co-host, Braden Kemp. I'm Tracy Morningstar. Please join us again next time for the Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It was really fun.
We'll be right back after this short break.
The Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business builds bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, businesses, and communities. CCAB offers a diverse array of programming, including training, networking, major business awards, and national events. Head to ccab.com to explore resources, connect, and help build a new economy based on mutual respect and shared prosperity.
We return to the Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast with co-hosts Braden Kemp and Tracy Morningstar.
Our understanding of the world is hugely expanded today because of Thomas and the work that he does. When it comes to caring for Mother Earth and the many contributions people are making within Canada are really making positive impacts that I didn't realize until today.
Yeah, it's such a big concept, and that's what I was trying to get at with my admittedly long-winded question to Thomas there is the concept of the coastline and the vastness of it, and in so many instances, the complete inaccessibility of it makes it hard to wrap your head around effectively an agriculture or aquaculture operation happening in those places. But it sounds like those things are happening, and it sounds like Thomas and the team at Coastal Carbon has technology and a mechanism to monitor those activities and ultimately drive investment in and growth in them, which is a fantastic and a really positive outlook for those coastline communities, but also for us as humans in general as we work to solve this greenhouse gas and carbon problem.
Yeah. I never understood carbon credits, and he definitely has explained how they have a influence in what he does. And our conversation always brings us back to contributions that entrepreneurs are playing today, and to ensure that we continue down this path of a new frontier.
Yeah, it's awesome to see so many entrepreneurs and specifically so many young entrepreneurs focusing on businesses that have the double bottom line is a sustainable company that can grow and have profits, but also is solving a real problem, for the environment and the world that we live in. So it's pretty neat to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank Thomas Storwick for joining us once again. I'd also like to thank my co-host Braden Kemp. I'm Tracy Morningstar. Please join us again next time for the Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast.
This edition of the Frontier Entrepreneurship Podcast was made possible with the support of FedDev Ontario and the Government of Canada. Special thanks to Victoria Pitchler. The executive producer of Frontier Entrepreneurship is Robert Washburn. I'm John Hayden. To find out more, head to our website, ncftc.ca. That's ncftc.ca. Thanks for listening.